My great-grandmother, born on October the 7th, 1896, believed until the day that she died man never walked on the moon. Imel Wagner was 5 when the Wright brothers first made their flight. And who could blame her for believing that the moon landings were impressive TV productions when man had not even flown a few feet off the ground when she was born? Just 2 months before Imel Wagner left this life, when I was but 6 years old, my family was in Indiana to visit her daughter, my grandmother, on April the 12th, 1981. Dad woke me early that Sunday morning to watch as John Young and Robert Crippen took the space shuttle Columbia on her maiden voyage, and I was hooked on space exploration. I collected models of the space shuttle. I can't tell you how many things of those I put together. Autographs of astronauts, including an autograph of Neil Armstrong. And my room was littered, at least my mother would say so, of pictures of the space shuttle and Apollo flights. So when I started my YouTube channel, it was only natural that I post some videos of the space program. One of the first videos I posted was of Bart Sabrell's being punched in the face by Buzz Aldrin. Oh, I had seen that clip on several news channels and on several YouTube channels, and I believe therefore it was in the public domain. Well, to come to find out, that clip is from the documentary Astronauts Gone Wild, and Bart Sabrell, who produced that documentary, holds the copyright. I got a copyright strike on my account, and I contacted Bart and asked if he removed and explained to him that I honestly believed it was public domain. Bart replied and asked me to read an article he wrote and to watch a couple documentaries. Let him know what I thought, and we'd go from there. Well, I don't mind to tell you that I thought Bart was off his rocker. But that was before I watched his documentaries and read the article he wrote. Bart made some extremely valid points, and he offered to sit down for an interview to discuss these matters. What follows is that interview. I ask you to hold judgment until you've heard and investigated the evidence for yourself. God bless. I first heard about you on the national news when Buzz Aldrin hit you, punched you.
You're the one who said you walked on the moon when you didn't. Calling the kettle black, if I ever thought of it. Saying I misrepresented myself.
Away from me.
You're a coward and a liar and a thief.
Tell us about that encounter.
Well, we had produced, prior to that, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, which was a $500,000 documentary showcasing newly discovered footage of them falsifying being halfway to the moon, proving that the Apollo 11 crew never left Earth orbit. After all, if they're faking being halfway to the moon, it means they could not go halfway. Additionally, we have a separate third secret channel of audio of the CIA prompting them only to speak after 4 seconds have elapsed in order to give the impression of an increased radio delay to show that they're further away from the moon than they really were. So once we knew for a fact that the moon missions were fake and we released the film, the idea came to me, I suppose, from watching courtroom TV programs as a kid. Hey, why not just ask them to swear on the Bible? So we tracked down some who would not give interviews in public places, and then we contacted others, telling them that we were doing a documentary about the moon landings, which is true. However, it was about the fact that they were fake. They didn't know that until the interviews became a little bit more confrontational. In the case of Buzz Aldrin, that happened, I believe, on September 10th, 2002. It was in Beverly Hills, California, at a hotel somewhere on Wilshire Boulevard. And Japanese crew who I was working with and producing a separate documentary had me as kind of a surprise guest. And when it came out, that I was there, he became, I guess, a little upset. And I asked him to swear on the Bible whether he walked on the moon or not. He didn't wake up that morning saying, I can't wait to punch Bart Sabrell, and I didn't wake up that morning saying I can't wait to call him a liar, a coward, and a thief. They're just one of those things that just happened and got turned up. Since then, it's been brought to my attention trying to be a Christian myself, that I was rebuking an older man in a disrespectful way. The fact is, I have been a liar, a coward, and a thief myself. It's just that I'm mindful to be repentant of these things, and of course, he apparently is not. Otherwise, he would have confessed that he has deceived the whole world about this. Additionally, there are scriptures that point to it being inappropriate to ask anyone to take an oath, which I wasn't aware of at the time. Jesus said so himself, and I think it's mentioned in the book of James as well. So had I to do it all over again, I may not have produced Astronauts Gone Wild, but it was at the time, to the best of my ability, I thought it was fair and appropriate to contact these people and to confront them. After all, they are criminals. I mean, if someone gets away with murder and they're acquitted even though they're guilty, they have a right to be confronted about the truth. I mean, that's a wide open, game. And what we have here is a lie of biblical proportion. I mean, that's why we opened the film A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon with scriptures. And we show that the first boast of mankind was the Tower of Babel. I mean, up until about the 1800s, the greatest accomplishment of mankind was architecture. How high could you build a building without it collapsing on itself? And then after that, it was the largest machine that was ever built, the Titanic. And they put in publicity the ship that God himself could not sink. And then we have, allegedly, the greatest accomplishment of mankind, putting a man on the moon, and Richard Nixon, who knew about it, obviously, said it was the greatest event since creation itself, even though he knew that it was fraudulent. And you see, the Tower of Babel was never finished. The Titanic never made one voyage. And again, the moon landings are fake. I mean, we have to realize, this is the only event in human history, whether it was biological history, like someone breaking the 4-minute mile, or geological history, like someone climbing Mount Everest, or technological history, like someone breaking the sound barrier or flying over the Atlantic in an airplane, that no nation on Earth is said to be able to repeat it for 70 years. I mean, that's completely illogical. After Mount Everest was reached, many more people reached it. After Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic, thousands of airplanes and then millions of airplanes flew across the Atlantic. After the sound barrier, for someone to say the sound barrier was broken in 1969, but we can't repeat it for 70 years, you would laugh at them. How could that be the case? And yet somehow that same logic does not apply to the moon landings, because people were deceived into, wanting to believe something great about their nation. During the height of the Vietnam War, Richard Nixon said domestic protests against that war were the number one threat to the country. And so what about a great pep rally? I mean, after I interviewed people from NASA, several people from NASA told me face to face that the moon landings were fake, one of which worked, there at Rocketdyne. And he said he, edited a memo that said the odds of them reaching the moon with 1960s equipment on the first attempt was 1 in 10,000. I mean, just here on Earth, how many people died trying to climb Mount Everest before they first succeeded? 2 or 3 dozen? How many people died trying to reach the South Pole, before they did it successfully? Several people died. And yet we're to believe, almost 50 years ago, with 1/1,000th the computing power in all of NASA that is in a modern-day cell phone, they went 1,000 times farther than the farthest manned vehicle can go today on the very first attempt. I mean, that is completely illogical. And it's amazing, we know as Christians, we read the Bible, it says that pride blinds you from being able to see the truth. And, that's just the way that it is. We live in a deceptive world. I'm a pretty optimistic guy. I'm a half full kind of a guy. And yet, the longer I live, I'm 52, I discover that the world is even more wicked than I previously thought. I've talked to college professors who have said if they saw Neil Armstrong or Buzz Aldrin confess on national TV that it was fake, they would still believe that the moon landings are real. I mean, that's pretty amazing.
That's outrageous.
Yeah, and we know that genocide and the millions of people has happened because of their race or religion. We know that babies and children are raped. And we know that what is that in comparison with telling a lie about a scientific accomplishment? So many people have given back Nobel Prizes and prizes for science and written false scientific papers and cheated. And that's what they did. They simply bluffed like in poker. They pretended to go to guarantee a successful mission. And now the farthest astronaut can travel from the Earth is only 250 miles, or 1/1000th the distance, with 50 years, 5 decades more advancements. They can only go 1/1000th the distance as they could half a century ago with antiquated equipment.
On YouTube, there's a video of a NASA engineer talking about Orion, and they're going to have to figure out how to go through the Van Allen belts in order to get to Mars.
The upper stage of the rocket fires again. Like the setup for a roller coaster ride, this is the big climb we've been waiting for. We are headed 3,600 miles above Earth, 15 times higher from the planet than the International Space Station. As we get further away from Earth, we'll pass through the Van Allen belts, an area of dangerous radiation. Radiation like this could harm the guidance systems, onboard computers, or other electronics on Orion. Naturally, we have to pass through this danger zone twice, once up and once back. But Orion has protection. Shielding will be put to the test as the vehicle cuts through the waves of radiation. Sensors aboard will record radiation levels for scientists to study. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space.
Which I think is interesting. I mean, if they've done it before, why do they need to research how to do it again? What are the Van Allen belts?
Well, the Van Allen belts are magnetic fields that exist approximately 1,000 miles above the Earth and extend an additional at least 25,000 miles, or perhaps more. So every manned mission, space mission, Gemini, Mercury, Skylab, the space shuttle, the space station, all of that is well below 750 miles below that radiation, except going to the moon. They would have to go through these radiation belts twice, once going to the moon and once upon their return. Now, about 3 years ago, the Orion project was sent up by NASA, unmanned, to 3,600 miles, did a U-turn and came back. So if you go to the store, U-turn and come home, the destination is the store. So if you go 3,600 miles and U-turn, the destination is 3,600 miles. So what is that? 3,600 miles, the Van Allen radiation belt. And 2 different Geiger counters on board. Kelly Smith, in his 20s, did this NASA video in which he said they are dangerous fields of radiation and that they must first discover a way to protect astronauts from it before they can send people through it. That means the technology to protect astronauts going through the Van Allen radiation belts has not yet been invented. So then how did they go to the moon? And, I've talked to several people at NASA who still work there to this day, who know the moon landings are fake, and they do their best of their ability to help researchers like me expose that. They want to keep their jobs and not get in trouble, and you can't really blame them for, being a little cautious about that. The fact is, I asked them, I said, well, why don't you give me these Geiger counter readings, of the radiation belts? And they said, well, that information is classified. I said, now, wait a minute. When you send probes to the sun, the temperature of the sun, that's not classified. If you send probes to Jupiter, how much helium is in Jupiter's atmosphere, that's not classified. So why would a part of nature, just the amount of radiation and the radiation belts surrounding the Earth, why would that be classified? Because if they released the fact that it is 5 to 100 times a lethal dose, then that would prove that the moon missions did not happen. That's why the information is classified.
In Astronauts Gone Wild, the most interesting encounter there for me is Alan Bean and his reaction to the Van Allen belts.
Any ill effects from the Van Allen radiation belts?
No, now I'm not sure we went far enough out to encounter the Van Allen radiation belt. Maybe we did.
Beginning at an altitude of 1,000 miles and extending an additional 25,000 miles lay lethal bands of radiation called the Van Allen radiation belts. Every space mission in history with humans on board, from both the United States and Soviet Union, from the first in 1961 to the present, has been well below this deadly radiation field. Mercury, Gemini, Soyuz, Skylab, the Space Shuttle, all maintained altitudes well below 1,000 miles. All except Apollo.
I don't know the distance to the Van Allen radiation belt, and if we did, it wasn't a problem. If we were going to encounter it, then we would have had to build the spacecraft and the spacesuit to not give humans a problem. You don't just build something and hope it works. You study to see what the threats are, the environment is, and then you say, how thick do I have to make the metal on the spacecraft so that going through this kind of radiation or these kind of meteoroids, it won't get hurt. And so then we build it that way.
The belts are 1,000 miles to 25,000 miles above the Earth.
Then we went right out through them.
No effects on your cells?
Didn't even know it. I don't think anybody, well, maybe somebody said you went through the radiation belt, but we didn't feel it inside, and we didn't get any, added radiation.
In 1998, the Space Shuttle flew to an altitude of 350 miles, one of its highest altitudes ever, hundreds of miles below the beginning of a field of radiation that was so severe that the astronauts inside of their shielded spacecraft and inside of their shielded spacesuits saw flashes of light with their eyes shut that they described as shooting stars, due to radiation penetrating first the shuttle's shielding, then their spacesuit shielding, then their skulls, and finally the retinas of their closed eyes. As a result, CNN issued the following report noting NASA's unpredicted surprise. The radiation belt surrounding Earth may be more dangerous for spacewalking astronauts than previously believed. Scientists say the phenomena known as the Van Allen belts can spawn killer electrons when the Earth's magnetic field changes. These electrons that are being studied could have an important effect, not only on satellites, which has happened in the past, but could also affect the astronauts by creating large doses of radiation that could influence their health. The electrons can penetrate through various materials, including spacesuits, and can pass through, in fact, the walls of the space station, and can create high charges deep inside of these objects.
No strange occurrences?
Nothing like that.
The space shuttle...
Go ahead.
The space shuttle went to 365 miles a few years ago. Because I worked in news. I saw CNN. They said that the radiation belts surrounding Earth are more dangerous than previously believed because the astronauts saw shooting stars with their eyes closed. Just when they got within 600.
Radiation belt. We saw shooting stars, but they're not shooting stars from with your eyes closed, although they look like it. If you're out in space beyond the Van Allen belt, and probably within the Van Allen belt, and close your eyes, and just pay attention. You don't notice it unless you pay attention. Then all of a sudden you'll see a little flash like a shooting star, except it's like that. There goes one this way. Then one just blossoms. And then not that fast. Maybe you wait 3 minutes or 2 minutes and one goes whoosh. And what's happening is cosmic rays are hitting the back of your eye and exciting those sensors in the back of your eye. So that's what you see. And they got high enough apparently to close it. My guess is in Earth orbit, if you closed your eyes and just paid attention, that you would see them.
The first time they were seen was when they went to 365 miles.
Yes.
That's 650 miles below or away from the radiation.
Yeah, see, it's below. My guess if they just did it tonight. But see, if you're just going to sleep or closing your eyes or it's dark, you don't notice them. But if you'll close your eyes and pay attention, which we had an experiment to do, by the way, then you see them whistling by. Not on our mission, by the way, they hadn't been discovered yet. I saw them one day on the moon. It wasn't dark, and it was kind of dark, and I saw this flash of light, and it looked like it was on the moon, but really it wasn't. It was a flash of light in my eye.
How did you get that interview? How did it come about? Well, you talked about how you got the interview, but describe the encounter with Bean, if you would, and how he he seemed so shocked at first, never heard of the Van Allen belts, but as you continued to talk to him, he had a perfect recollection of it.
Well, it was a little bit unusual. You can see that in Astronauts Gone Wild, which is kind of the second film about the moon landings being fake, where I just, confront the astronauts, as many as we could get an interview with. Basically, half of them know better than to ever give interviews, which is 2/3 of the first mission to the moon, the crew. Michael Collins and Neil Armstrong refused to give interviews about it. But some of them are very talkative, especially Buzz Aldrin and Alan Bean, for instance. They charge $2,000 an hour for the honor to be lied to. And the guy gets so cocky and nonchalant about it when I point out to them, what about this dangerous field of radiation? He said, well, then we didn't go through it. Then when I pointed out to him, I don't think you're paying attention here. You allegedly did. He said, oh, okay, I guess we did. And then when I pointed out to him that the space shuttle, I think it was 1994, went up to 365 miles, which is still, more than 600 miles away from the radiation, they could close their eyes and see the radiation as sparks of light. And you have to imagine wherever you are there, Justin, that if there was some nuclear power plant melting down 600 miles away and you could close your eyes and see the radiation, that's pretty severe radiation.
Yes.
And so CNN reported at that time with this report, I'm quoting it word for word, the radiation belt surrounding the Earth is more dangerous than previously believed. So why is it that a space shuttle crew in 1994, more than 600 miles away from the radiation, knows more about the radiation belts than the Apollo astronauts? The only way that could be true is if the Apollo astronauts, in fact, did not go through it. They descended to a lower altitude, and they basically said they cannot go above about 250 miles in order to stay safe.
Well, one of the things that baffles me about Bean, especially watching that encounter, he spends so much time painting these landscapes on the surface of the moon. And that just seems interesting to me. I know you can't, you're not a psychologist, but it's just, that intrigues me. And something that, I don't know, just kind of, I wonder about sometimes, If he were never there, why would he spend time painting those things?
Well, it would be for money. I mean,
okay.
Buzz Aldrin keeps pulling things out of the closet that he claims, were in his pocket or in the spacecraft going to the moon. 1 year it's a watch, 1 year it's a quarter, whatever. And he claimed, that this was in a spacecraft or spacesuit on the way to the moon or on the moon or whatever. And he sells them for a couple $100,000 each. If I were not a believer and had already gotten away with this great lie, and, Neil Armstrong became CEO of a company he probably did nothing really legitimate, contribution to. But to say, hey, Neil Armstrong is the CEO of our, rocket bomb company for the Pentagon, hey, that's pretty elaborate. I'd pay him probably 20 million, maybe 50 million a year just to have him as our, CEO, whether he did anything or not. And the same with Alan Bean. I think he sells these pictures for $100,000 more each. And, it probably takes 2 or 3 days, to do it. And they're not that good a quality. I mean, they're okay, probably better than I could do, but they also look like maybe a high school student can also do better. But, that's what he says. So if you don't believe in God, which I don't see how any of these people could actually believe in God to what and I know real belief is. The Bible says in James that even the demons, believe in God, but that's more of an acknowledgement that there is a God. But unless you obey, then you really don't believe. And so these people have not confessed that the moon landings are fake, and so therefore they are not believers, no matter what they say. So if you put yourself in that atheistic point of view, then you've already made millions off of it, and you want to make millions more and pay your electric bill and go to Hawaii and whatever. What difference does it make whether you're painting a picture of being on the moon or claimed a penny? Just make sure the date, is before 1960.
Absolutely.
Got to double check that.
I was watching on Netflix last night a documentary in which you appear, and I think it was Conspiracy, the moon landing. I forget. I think it's on your YouTube channel as well. The most interesting thing there was the reaction of the Grissom family to Apollo 1 and the fact that they believe it's very suspicious and really don't believe it was an accident.
Apollo astronauts Roger Chaffee, Edward White, and Gus Grissom lose their lives in a tragic flash fire aboard their grounded space capsule. The tragedy occurred during a simulated countdown for the first flight of the Apollo program, whose goal is to put a man on the moon by 1970. Grissom and White were veterans of spaceflight, Chaffee a rookie. During a drill similar to this, the entire three-man crew was engulfed by flames. A blue ribbon panel of space experts is investigating, aided by impounded NASA films and tape recordings. Grissom was one of the 7 original astronauts. White was America's first spacewalker. Chaffee, never in space, had long experience as a jet test pilot. He was proud and happy that his first flight was to initiate the Apollo program. When the tragedy struck, one of the astronauts shouted, "Fire in the spacecraft!" In a few seconds, all 3 were victims of the swift inferno which left the capsule a blackened shell. One reporter said it looked like the inside of a furnace. Investigators theorized that perhaps a short circuit or electrical overload may have sparked the blaze. 27 would-be rescuers were all overcome by smoke and heat. Apollo astronauts Chaffee, White, and Grissom, martyred heroes who gave their lives in total dedication to duty. Their memory will forever be honored.
How many astronauts have died over this?
Well, that film is called Conspiracy Theory, Did We Land on the Moon?
Okay.
And originally, Fox was going to air If Anything Happened on the Way to the Moon. And it was also going to be the first film on the documentary channel. And then it was also going to broadcast on the BBC. And days before this broadcast was to occur, somebody made a phone call to somebody, and it never aired. So what they did in Fox's case to kind of compensate for, that retraction was to produce their own film called Conspiracy Theory, Did We Land on the Moon? So the public loved it so much, they aired it not twice, but 3 times in about 3 years. And it's an extremely well-made film in which myself, Bill Casey, and a few other people are interviewed. Now, in regard to the Apollo 1 fire, which I believe took place on January 27th, well, I think it was it 1967, I believe?
I believe so.
They interviewed Betty Grissom, the widow of Gus Grissom, and also Scott Grissom, one of his sons. Mm-hmm. I interviewed them at length personally, off the record, and they asked me to, keep certain information private until they pursued their own investigations. But what I can tell you is that they are both 100% convinced that the Apollo 1 fire was set deliberately. Now, this was basically a test of just the, internal switching of, video cameras and switches and things like that inside the spacecraft. Or the rockets were not even being fired. And the Apollo 1 crew was going to be the first crew to walk on the moon, largely because of the popularity of their commander, Gus Grissom, Virgil Gus Grissom. He had a problem, I think, in a Mercury landing in which when it splashed down in the ocean, the explosive bolts of the door were triggered when it bounced kind of underwater, filling the capsule with water. He had in his pockets, he confessed at the press conference, a couple of rolls of nickels from the bank to give to his son to pass out to his elementary school friends to say, hey, this nickel had been in outer space. But as he starts sinking to the bottom of the ocean with all this extra weight in his pockets, he realized it wasn't such a bright idea. And that kind of that confession endeared, the public to him. And then when one reporter asked him, were you afraid? He said, of course I was afraid. And it said, this guy's just, such an honest person. And so the media loved him, the public loved him. So NASA said, hey, this is the guy who's going to be the first man to walk on the moon. Unfortunately for him, he was so honest, he kept criticizing the, dilapidated equipment that was allegedly going to put him on the moon in, 2 years' time, according to Kennedy's goal. And he said, we're 10 years at least from going to the moon, not 2. How is this going to happen? And he kept complaining up the chain of command, and no one would do anything about it. And he couldn't figure out why. The reason is because the higher-ups knew they were not going to go to the moon. Either they were going to eat humble pie and say we bit off more than we could chew, or they were going to fake it. And at that point, they hadn't decided, and they had not, therefore, told the astronauts about it. And that's why they didn't have to fix anything. They had already achieved Earth orbit, and so that's all that they were going to end up doing anyway, so what difference does it make whether they fix this or that? One of the last statements Gus Grissom made before he burned alive in that spacecraft was talking, through a communication system that was wired between 2 buildings, and it wouldn't work. And he's like, guys, how are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 2 buildings? And they didn't hear him. Say that again? We didn't hear you. And he said, how are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 2 buildings?
Hey, how are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 3 buildings? I can't hear a thing you're saying. Jesus Christ. Again? But how are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings?
Now, they did some interesting things prior to that particular, event. One of which was, I think, just a few weeks before, he held an impromptu press conference where he affixed a lemon to the top of the spacecraft and invited some media to take a picture of it. The guy who's supposed to be the guy going to the moon, is calling the spacecraft a lemon. So that was what got him, targeted, I believe, for assassination, rather than him having an accident at home, which would draw more attention to singling him out. They burned the other 3 people along with him. They had pressurized that, with 100% oxygen at 4 atmospheres, which they knew not to do. And according to Scott and Betty Grissom, they have forensic evidence that shows there was a wire deliberately separated so that a spark would jump. They found oil rags underneath his seat soaked in oil. They were doing everything possible to make sure they burned alive. Now, the initial report I heard, and I read the congressional reports about this thing, which we had to buy for $10,000 at auction of the estate of, I think it was the White family, which is one of the other astronauts. And they said that they were buckled in. Now, they later contradict this, but they were buckled in when they found their bodies. So, the very first thing you're going to do if there's a fire is unbuckle yourself to get out. But they were still buckled in, according to the original report. They also said the CIA is somehow involved in it. They didn't go into great detail, but they implied, well, maybe the Russians were trying to do it to trip us up to win the space race. The Russians would never do that. That would cause World War III. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And the reason why the CIA was there is because the CIA was the one who did it. Why would the CIA need to be at NASA for any reason? There's no reason. But they were all over the place, that day of the fire.
It is hard to ask with a straight face. But Why would the government lie?
Well, like I said, the CIA is known for doing very odd things. They admitted to staging the start of the Vietnam War, the Gulf of Tonkin incident,
Right.
which led to the killing of about 1 million Vietnamese and 50,000 or more Americans. All the serious investigators of the JFK assassination conclude universally that it was the CIA who did it. The CIA, basically runs the country, and they admitted to having more than 400 journalists. This is in the 70s. 400 journalists at all the major magazines and TV stations. Even though the United States laws since I think 1947 said domestic propaganda is illegal. It's also illegal to lie through television since the quiz show scandal. And all these laws, they simply break themselves. Many people believe that Revelation 13, the second beast, is the United States of America. And it certainly seems that that's a very plausible interpretation of it. We know throughout history things turn upside down. The Bible says that what is good will be called evil and what is evil will be called good. You can see the Republican Party from the time of Lincoln turning upside down the Democratic Party philosophy. They were against civil rights. They fought against it and against it. Now they're allegedly the champion of it. You have the founding of the church, being sincere and being led by Christ and the apostles, turning into the Church of Rome, which is the exact opposite. They're the first beast in Revelation 13. You have America starting off sincerely with the founding fathers and wanting to print their own currency before the bankers came in and took it all over, and then the country just going, terrible. I mean, we're warmongers. We go around and pick fights with people all around the world. We've been at war, 95% of the time since the institution of our country. Why do they lie? I mean, it's pretty sad. That's the first sin on planet Earth. Wasn't adultery. It wasn't stealing. It wasn't murder. It was lying. When you kill somebody, there's the dead body. There's the widow and the orphans. When you steal something, here's the possession that I have that you no longer have. But when you lie, where is it? You see, it's a truly ethereal sin. How many people are in prison for lying? You see, it's the number one sin misdeed of evil people because you can hardly ever get caught lying. And it seems harmless. We know from study there were Apollo astronauts who were silenced because of it. But in general, I got an email just the other day saying, well, what harm did it do, even if they lied? Well, that's pretty sad when people think lying is okay.
Yeah.
Don't you want to know the true history of things? I mean, whether Lincoln was a good person or a bad person, or whether the Civil War was about slavery or about states' rights. I mean, just don't you want to know the truth? What the cure to cancer is? If someone knows and lies about it, isn't that relevant? If I were king of the world, it's probably good that I'm not. I thought about this, Justin. I would make the only capital punishment I would give would be for lying. That if you confessed you killed somebody, then, you won't get the death penalty or whatever. And what the president could do, any president now or future, could grant complete amnesty for people who told the truth about 9/11, the Kennedy assassination, the moon landing, whatever. Grant complete amnesty. They're going to face, all these people are probably old, on the verge of dying anyway, and they're going to face God. The truth is more important than that, and it's pretty sad that the lies have come to this degree. Almost everything, it seems like, in our society now is lying. And it's amazing how you're persecuted for saying the truth. I get emails, Justin, from people who say they wish they could watch me and my wife and children burn alive before them.
Wow. For
saying that I think the government lied about this one thing. Isn't that amazing?
That is. That is totally amazing.
And that fanaticism shows that this moon landing has become a god, because it's like when you insult Muhammad, they become foaming at the mouth and kill people. And now I'm saying that the moon landings are fake, and people react the same way. That's proof that the moon landings have become a god to people. I mean, if a professor of a major university says that if he saw an Apollo 11 astronaut confess that they were fake, that he would still believe that they were real, that has become a god. It's a god to any people who can claim to be in the, in intellectual or in the aerospace business or whatever. That's look how great we are. This Imel guy, who claims to be a preacher, and yet all he does is write all day about politics. It's become a god to him. How dare I say that the United States, faked the moon landing? It's like your team winning the Super Bowl. How dare you say they cheated to do it? But what if they did? Don't you want to know the truth?
True.
Jesus said the truth will set you free.
The pictures from the moon landing. Talk about the shadow and the lighting in those pictures, if you would.
Yeah, well, you can see from A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, which is only about a 45-minute film. There are pictures that we demonstrate. If you go outside, on a cloudless day, high noon, and stand out in your front yard or parking lot and stand 2 to 3 feet from a friend, you'll see your shadows run in the same direction. And no matter where you stand, they will never, ever intersect. That's because the sun is 93 million miles away and about 1,000 times greater diameter than the Earth, and it's a sole light source, and it will never cast intersecting shadows. So the point is, they claimed that these pictures on the moon were lit with sunlight, because with no atmosphere, it would make it even 20 times brighter than a desert on Earth at noon. So the last thing they would need would be electrical lighting. And yet, as a filmmaker, my job is to make fake scenes look real. So I can tell you, looking at them, that there was 100% these pictures that they claim are on the surface of the moon were lit with electrical light in a studio. And some of the pictures, which we show in the film, are from an object like an astronaut and then a rock, and the shadows are going at 90 degrees and they're like 3 feet apart from one another. Yeah. I mean, that's simply impossible.
From an analytical standpoint, photographic anomalies have to be sought out with an understanding of lighting and shadows. The most straightforward is simple. When objects are lit solely by the sun, as all the scenes on the moon were said to be, after all, lighting equipment was not only impractical, it was unnecessary in bright sunlight, then all shadows, regardless of the landscape, will run parallel with one another and never intersect, as shown by this example. In these seldom seen photographs, obtained from a rarely used auxiliary NASA archival site, it is clear that these scenes were lit with artificial light. These shadows, which are cast at different angles, are evidence that a second light source is being used. In addition, the sun would not cause an isolated hotspot like this, only an artificial light would. Again, intersecting shadows and another hotspot. And again. And again. It is simply impossible for this picture to have been taken with sunlight on the moon. Here, the shadows are shown to be as black as pitch. And yet here, completely in a shadow, the astronaut is lit up like a Christmas tree. How can this be? Or this, on the shadow side of the lunar module.
And then if you look at the black and white TV image, which what everyone saw of the astronauts kind of floating around, if you have professional video equipment and double the speed, you're like, oh my gosh, it's slow motion. That proves they didn't go to the moon.
To demonstrate 1/6 gravity, a bouncy, floaty feel to the astronaut's movements would be similarly achieved with relative simplicity. Slow motion. You are viewing the scenes as they aired more than 30 years ago. Now let's look at them with the speed doubled. It becomes discernible that they are, in fact, in Earth's gravity, and are no more leaving the ground than they would on Earth.
I mean, I got an email recently from some arrogant guy who claims to be a preacher, although he talks more about politics than Christ, and he said, I would beat you in a debate that the moon landings are real. I mean, so arrogant, it's unbelievable, and I'll tell him exactly how he can beat me, if you're watching. Here's how you beat me. You show one other event in the entire history of the world in which an accomplishment, a 4-minute mile or Mount Everest or the sound barrier or anything you want to prove that was a milestone was made and no one repeated it for 70 years. Then I'll concede the moon landings are real.
One thing, and I think it was in one of your articles rather than in one of your documentaries, but you mentioned the fact that it was during the Nixon administration this took place. And if there's ever a deceitful administration that we know about, let me put it that way, definitely the Nixon administration. Now, I don't think that Nixon did anything necessarily worse than others. He was just caught. And we know how corrupt that administration was. And that's interesting. That did take
well, and so is the previous one. A lot of people believe, Johnson was, Satan's, cousin. And it was actually during the Johnson administration that the formula for faking the moon landing was put together. In fact, I think in the entire history of America, there were only 2 incumbents who refused to run for re-election, one of which was Johnson, because he knew that the faking a moon landing was about to happen at the dawn of the next administration. And who knew that would work? Might work, might not work. How would you like to go down in history as the president who tried to fake the moon landing and got caught? I mean, Richard Nixon didn't even show up at the launch. He showed up like at the 3rd or 4th launch once it was proven that they could get away with it. But the guy doesn't, he's so afraid of shaking the astronaut's hand and the whole thing coming unwound, that he doesn't even go to the launch. How could you not go to the launch? If they're really going to the moon and you're the president of the United States, but he was literally, physically distancing himself from it in case they got caught.
He did send Agnew. I guess you send the vice president to do the dirty work. Apollo 13. You think NASA was really so callous to allow the astronauts to stay in orbit that long?
Well, they're only in Earth orbit.
Right.
None of them left Earth orbit. Not even Apollo 13.
Right.
So each moon mission, if it lasts a couple of days longer, they're going anywhere from 8 to 12 days in Earth orbit. They spend a year in Earth orbit now at the International Space Station. So it's really not that big of a deal. It's a little bit uncomfortable, but a lot of people would pay everything they had to get a chance just to go into zero gravity into Earth orbit. People don't realize, but after the public accepted that the moon missions were real after Apollo 11, it actually became easier to fake them after that because people already believed them to be true. Apollo 12, most people don't remember, but like a minute and a half into the television transmission, the camera malfunctioned, and so that was all that they had. And then Apollo 13 allegedly, had this, catastrophe that didn't allow them to go to the moon. So the time between the first moon mission and the next one in which they had TV coverage was 2 years to get their act together. The Illuminati, Masons, whatever, they're into all this numerology. We have Apollo 13 launched on April 13th, and at 13:13 military time, they allegedly have this accident. People were complaining that reruns of I Love Lucy were being interrupted when they went to the moon the second time. I mean, imagine right now they're planting a flag on the South Pole. You and I would take a pause, we'd be watching it together, right? And we'd talk about how great it was. And then let's say you and I are talking 6 months from now and they're going the second time. Do we have it on the second time? I'm afraid not.
Yeah, right.
And so the same thing. When they went to the moon the second time, we were like, yeah, whatever, they've already done that. So they threw this element of life and death jeopardy to show, the excitement and the intrigue of it again. They never left Earth orbit either. They can't. They cannot leave because the equipment, for one, didn't have enough fuel. They couldn't protect astronauts from radiation, and the lunar module wouldn't land. Look at Elon Musk. How many times did he attempt to land a rocket vertically? I know it's at least 6, and it might be more than that, And this is with all the greater technology, 1 million times more computing power. I mean, to land a rocket vertically takes a lot of computing power. The space shuttle, flies automatically through computers because it's so aerodynamically fragile that a human could not fly it. Computers fly that thing. And so with computers that are 1 million times faster than Apollo had, it took him 6 to 12 times, I don't know how many times, to land vertically. And yet they did it the first time and no atmosphere on the moon. with a million times less computing power. That's amazing, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I know that you talk about this in I think, an article, maybe a documentary as well. People who say, I had somebody who worked on the Apollo program, and we know it wasn't fake because my uncle worked on it. I have met a gentleman. I am good friends with his grandson-in-law, who was one of the engineers, if you've seen the movie Apollo 13, sitting at the table when all the stuff was dumped and told they had to fix the carbon monoxide or dioxide containers. And what do you say to people like that?
Well, this guy who I told you about, who sends out all these emails every day about politics, yet he claims to be a preacher of Christ, who said not to be involved in politics. He says he, had dinner with Neil Armstrong, and that's why he believes they went. I mean, Neil Armstrong didn't tell his wife for her own protection. He didn't tell his children. So you think he's going to tell one guy he meets one day, hey, by the way, the moon missions are fake, but don't tell anybody. I mean, that's the excuse if you don't think, deeper than 1 millimeter. Hey, there were 500,000 people involved at some level, faking the moon landing. How could you keep a secret from that many people? Well, you couldn't. Right. Therefore, you didn't tell them. Do you think they really told the guy making the glove or the boot, hey, the moon missions are fake, but don't tell anybody? I mean, you see this dolly shot at the beginning of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon during the launch, and this is like the last minute before they go to the moon for the very first time, and all the guys are kicked back watching television, just like we were, because they all received a computer program. There are people who have admitted that they could tell no difference, and these were flight controllers, they could tell no difference between an actual flight and a simulation. They had launched a satellite called the Tetra A satellite to simulate transmissions coming from the moon. They claimed it crashed into the ocean so that it would be up there secretly and people wouldn't know about it. To say my uncle, worked, mowing the lawn at the Super Bowl, and he knows, from that the game wasn't fixed. That doesn't have anything to do with anything. Right. The reason why people believe that the moon missions are real, even though they're not, is simply emotion. That's why a professor will tell you if he saw an astronaut who was on the surface of the moon confess that he was really in a TV studio, he would still believe they went anyway because he emotionally wants to. You see what I'm saying? It's really amazing.
And you get so many people involved, it becomes this legend, if you will. People, like the man I mentioned, whom I have met and whose family I know well. Of course, they all believe it. Here is my grandfather who worked on this project. You start getting all this pride, which I think is the big issue here. You start getting all this pride in my uncle helped make the boot or the glove. You really start spreading this out to where so many people had parts in this, it becomes believable. If you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, well, the ground controllers, who are more involved in the mission second to the astronauts, said that they could tell no difference between a simulation and an actual flight. And they know more about than the people who made the glove and the boot and all that. Then you have them going off. They have fake trajectory coming back. And you have really only the 3 astronauts, the flight director, and then von Braun, who built the rocket, who probably know Nixon and a few people who built the fake sets and all that. I mean, in Astronauts Gone Wild, we confront Cernan with von Braun's original documents that said it would take 3 rockets, each taller than the Empire State Building, each weighing 800,000 tons. Now, the Saturn V weighed something like 2,500 tons, and that's a difference of a little bit less than 30,000%. And he said it would take 3 rockets, not 1. He said a space station would have to be built first, and from there, ferry the fuel to go to the moon. All of that he recanted. I mean, just like Van Allen, he said that the radiation belts in a 1957 article, which we can link, in your description of your video, he says it's 5 to 100 times a lethal dose. And then suddenly, when they tell him to, he says, oh, no, it's not lethal at all. I was wrong all this time. And a guy who's supposed to be a genius at math suddenly says, oh, I was wrong by a factor of 30,000% on the amount of fuel it would take to go to the moon. How can you trust a guy who made such a big mistake to get you there in the first place?
Exactly. Satellite pictures seem to show moon landings on the moon, these reconnaissance photos. What do you say about that?
Well, that's like asking a murderer for evidence that he did not commit the murder. You're asking the Fox, NASA, for proof that they didn't steal a chicken. I mean, they already faked full body pictures, up close of someone on the moon's surface, right?
Exactly.
So you're asking those same people to prove that they lied when they did that. Right? Mm-hmm. That's what you're really asking. Right?
Yeah.
And so they have these satellites orbiting the moon, which are unmanned, which can go through the radiation belt, because you can X-ray your toaster 1,000 times and still make toast, but you X-ray a human 1,000 times, you're going to kill them. So then they have these, satellite pictures, again, after they faked, being on the ground on the moon, and the little shadows or little, footprints or whatever they claim, are left by Apollo. That's simply not the case. China landed a probe on the moon, and if you want to compare something, you should look at the rocks. You have all of the rocks in the China picture are half buried under the ground because of all the micro meteorite dust that is bombarding the moon continually for however long it's been there. So every rock on the surface of the moon from the China probe is half buried under the ground. Look at the ones from the NASA pictures, and every rock was placed there on top of the dust. There's proof right there.
Yes, absolutely. As Bart notes, there is a huge difference between pictures from the Apollo landings of the moon rocks and pictures from China probes. Notice this picture from Apollo 16, April 1972. There is Charlie Duke standing beside the lunar rover, and behind him, about 2/3 down the image, you notice a rock there that is just simply sitting upon the surface of the moon. Here's a close-up of that rock. Then I want you to notice these pictures from the China probes, where there is not rock simply sitting upon the surface of the moon, but as you can see, there is dirt all around them, dust and debris from meteorite strikes. Very interesting difference. I texted my wife and told her I'd had a very good interview. And she said, "What do you think?" I said, "Honestly, I don't know what to think." And that is a big leap coming from me. Some of the evidence, I have a hard time saying that discredits the moon landing. Shadows, I still have a little trouble with that idea. But the Van Allen belts are a serious issue. As really you watch the reaction of the astronauts, and astronauts gone wild, and they're hiding something. That seems blatantly obvious to me. They are hiding something. What is it that they're hiding? Could it very well be? They're hiding that the United States never landed on the moon. God bless.
Not gone wild, but it was at the time, to the best of my ability. I thought it was fair and appropriate to contact these people and to confront them. After all, they are criminals. I mean, if someone gets away with murder and they're acquitted even though they're guilty, they have a right to be confronted about the truth. I mean, that's a wide open, game. And what we have here is a lie of biblical proportion. I mean, that's why we opened the film A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon with scriptures. And we show that the first boast of mankind was the Tower of Babel. I mean, up until about the 1800s, the greatest accomplishment of mankind was architecture. How high could you build a building without it collapsing on itself? And then after that, it was the largest machine that was ever built, the Titanic. And they put in publicity the ship that God himself could not sink. And then we have allegedly the greatest accomplishment of mankind, putting a man on the moon, and Richard Nixon, who knew about it obviously, said it was the greatest event since creation itself, even though he knew that it was fraudulent. And you see, the Tower of Babel was never finished. The Titanic never made one voyage. And again, the moon landings are fake. I mean, we have to realize, this is the only event in human history, whether it was biological history, like someone breaking the 4-minute mile, or geological history, like someone climbing Mount Everest, or technological history, like someone breaking the sound barrier or flying over the Atlantic in an airplane, that no nation on Earth is said to be able to repeat it for 70 years. I mean, that's completely illogical. After Mount Everest was reached, many more people reached it. After Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic, thousands of airplanes and then millions of airplanes flew across me, I suppose, from watching courtroom TV programs as a kid. Hey, why not just ask them to swear on the Bible? So we tracked down some who would not give interviews in public places, and then we contacted others, telling them that we were doing a documentary about the moon landings, which is true. However, it was about the fact that they were fake. They didn't know that until the interviews became a little bit more confrontational. In the case of Buzz Aldrin, that happened, I believe, on September 10th, 2002. It was in Beverly Hills, California, at a hotel somewhere on Wilshire Boulevard. And Japanese crew who I was working with and producing a separate documentary had me as kind of a surprise guest. And when it came out, that I was there, he became, I guess, a little upset. And I asked him to swear on the Bible whether he walked on the moon or not. He didn't wake up that morning saying, I can't wait to punch Bart Sobral, and I didn't wake up that morning saying, I can't wait to call him a liar, a coward, and a thief. They're just one of those things that just happened and got turned up. Since then, it's been brought to my attention, trying to be a Christian myself, that I was rebuking an older man in a disrespectful way. The fact is, I have been a liar, a coward, and a thief myself. It's just that I'm mindful to be repentant of these things, and of course, he apparently is not, otherwise he would have confessed that he has deceived the whole world about this. Additionally, there are scriptures that point to it being inappropriate to ask anyone to take an oath, which I wasn't aware of at the time. Jesus said so himself, and I think it's mentioned in the book of James as well. So had I to do it all over again, I may not have produced after the Atlantic, after the sound barrier. For someone to say the sound barrier was broken in 1969, but we can't repeat it for 70 years, you would laugh at them. How could that be the case? And yet somehow that same logic does not apply to the moon landings, because people were deceived into, wanting to believe something great about their nation. During the height of the Vietnam War, Richard Nixon said domestic protests against that war were the #1 threat to the country. And so what about a great pep rally? I mean, after I interviewed people from NASA, several people from NASA told me face to face that the moon landings were fake. One of which worked, there at Rocketdyne, and he said he, edited a memo that said the odds of them reaching the moon with 1960s equipment on the first attempt was 1 in 10,000. I mean, just here on Earth, how many people died trying to climb Mount Everest before they first succeeded? 2 or 3 dozen? How many people died trying to reach the South Pole? Before they did it successfully? Several people died. And yet we're to believe, almost 50 years ago, with 1/1,000th the computing power in all of NASA that is in a modern day cell phone, they went 1,000 times farther than the farthest manned vehicle can go today on the very first attempt. I mean, that is completely illogical. And it's amazing, we know as Christians, we read the Bible, it says that pride blinds you from being able to see the truth. And, that's just the way that it is. We live in a deceptive world. I'm a pretty optimistic guy. I'm a half full kind of a guy. And yet, the longer I live, I'm 52, I discover that the world is even more wicked than I previously thought. I've talked to college professors who've said if they saw
mood and explained to him that I honestly believed it was public domain. Bart replied and asked me to read an article he wrote and to watch a couple documentaries. Let him know what I thought, and we'd go from there. Well, I don't mind to tell you that I thought Bart was off his rocker. But that was before I watched his documentaries and read the article he wrote. Bart made some extremely valid points, and he offered to sit down for an interview to discuss these matters. What follows is that interview. I ask you to hold judgment until you've heard and investigated the evidence for yourself. God bless. I first heard about you on the national news when Buzz Aldrin hit you, punched you.
You're the one who said you walked on the moon when you didn't. Calling the kettle black, if I ever thought of it. Saying I misrepresented myself.
Away from me.
You're a coward and a liar and a thief.
Tell us about that encounter.
Well, we had produced, prior to that, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, which was a $500,000 documentary showcasing newly discovered footage of them falsifying being halfway to the moon, proving that the Apollo 11 crew never left Earth orbit. After all, if they're faking being halfway to the moon, it means they could not go halfway. Additionally, we have a separate third secret channel of audio of the CIA prompting them only to speak after 4 seconds have elapsed in order to give the impression of an increased radio delay to show that they're further away from the moon than they really were. So once we knew for a fact that the moon missions were fake and we released the film, the idea came to
My great-grandmother, born on October the 7th, 1896, believed until the day that she died man never walked on the moon. Imel Wagner was 5 when the Wright brothers first made their flight. And who could blame her for believing that the moon landings were impressive TV productions when man had not even flown a few feet off the ground when she was born? Just 2 months before Imel Wagner left this life, when I was but 6 years old, my family was in Indiana to visit her daughter, my grandmother, on April the 12th, 1981. Dad woke me early that Sunday morning to watch as John Young and Robert Crippen took the Space Shuttle Columbia on her maiden voyage, and I was hooked on space exploration. I collected models of the Space Shuttle. I can't tell you how many things of those I put together. Autographs of astronauts, including an autograph of Neil Armstrong. And my room was littered, at least my mother would say so, of pictures of the Space Shuttle and Apollo flights. So when I started my YouTube channel, it was only natural that I post some videos of the space program. One of the first videos I posted was of Bart Sabrels being punched in the face by Buzz Aldrin. Oh, I had seen that clip on several news channels and on several YouTube channels, and I believe therefore it was in the public domain. Well, come to find out, that clip is from the documentary Astronauts Gone Wild, and Bart Sabrel, who produced that documentary, holds the copyright. I got a copyright strike on my account, and I contacted Bart and asked if he